All right, time for something different. Normally I talk about video games here. Today we're talking about The Witcher Netflix. Now, I talked a lot about The Witcher video game, of course, on my channel because I cover RPGs here, but also I discussed a decent amount the upcoming Witcher Netflix series. Now it's finally out. I watched it over the weekend. I know there were a lot of people who sort of like sprinted through it and watched it day of, but for me personally, I just wanted to take my time, let my thoughts marinate on the show. It's going to be spoiler free, so don't worry. I'm going to deliver a little bit of additional information ahead of time so you guys know what you need to really be aware of going into this show. And overall, it's left me with a feeling of this was a solid show. It balanced a lot of things, but it had to do some reshuffling, which we'll get into because it is based off the book, mostly this book called The Last Wish, which is a collection of short stories in the Witcher universe based around Geralt, for example. And I read a decent amount of it here on this Kindle. This dead Kindle, as you guys can tell, I did not get around to finishing it. It is completely dead. You can tell last time I probably read was a while ago. But anyway, I enjoyed it. I'd say according to Kindle, because they track your percentage, I think I got like 65% of the way through. So a lot of the episodes were familiar to me and some actually weren't. But one of the most immediate changes that you know right off the bat is actually that Renfri is in episode 1, which changes up kind of the dynamic because according to some of the show writers, they wanted to provide Geralt making a choice, and I thought that was a really strong start for the show. There's also a little bit of reshuffling in terms of seeing the fall of Sintra right in the beginning, and it does not identify that there is a time gap there for those who aren't aware. There's like a 13-year space between the fall of Sintra and what we saw happening with Geralt, and when you combine that with some of the reshuffling, it makes one of the biggest issues with the show, but one that I personally don't mind, but I know a lot of others will, is it's not accessible unless you have additional information entering it and you know what's going on. But the show on its own does not identify that time skip, which I think is very important from just enjoying it in general, because it isn't until like episode 3 that you see a conversation between a council of people and you start to realize that, wow, this is how they're delivering that there is actually a time skip. And if you are not aware of that because you haven't read any of the books or done any research, it will absolutely catch you off guard and probably confuse you. Now, I found this show quite reminiscent of Game of Thrones, which I think a lot of people will like because the last season of Game of Thrones left a lot to be desired. It also reminded me a smidge of Lord of the Rings, naturally, you know, that mixture of fantasy, medieval. It has that feel to it, and it's not as, I guess, lovable as those, in my opinion, but it stands a chance to become that. I think the biggest enemy of this show is that there were so many arcs to balance right off the bat, and so there's this initial revolving door of characters because potential side characters that could be interesting get killed off like instantly always throughout this show. And so it's hard for the show to really settle down. So that beginning, the first 2 episodes I thought were rocky and trying to understand like where everything was heading because there's so many narrative threads starting and they're switching constantly between them all. So as the show hits its groove in the later episodes, that's when it really settles in. And I think it's at its best because you know what's going on, you know where it's heading. And because of this revolving door of characters, really all your attention is obviously, and it should be, on Geralt, Ciri, and Yennefer. All 3 of them I thought were fantastic, and I really didn't expect that. I think that you can see Henry Cavill's love for The Witcher in this show with like the conversations with Roach. I think that was his own personal touch there. What I also really liked about him was his tone, right? It wasn't exactly the Witcher we're used to from the games, and at first I thought he was going to start sounding like a wannabe Batman, which is what I was afraid of, but I think the voice that he gave for The Witcher was really good. One thing that is subtracted from the book that I noticed that is not here in the show is Geralt doesn't communicate as much. And obviously the book allows for more of that dive in, right? Because you're not limited to an hour section on a show, right? And you got to produce all these different things and make it visually entertaining, of course, on top of all of that. Now, it's just like words on paper, right? So you have all this time to really dive into characters and have Geralt speak more and interact more. So sometimes, at least early on in the show, I felt like he was just kind of like the cool action dude floating from scene to scene. But as the show goes on, he really does build into someone lovable. I think Dandelion kind of brings out some of the better parts of him because they have a really good dynamic. There's a good chemistry there and a shocking amount of humor. I know the Witcher games have some humor from time to time, but I never just associated the games with that. Like, it was just like a little touch here or there. But I was surprised. This show did make me chuckle from time to time, and I like that. I also found Yennefer one of the more enjoyable parts of the show, because when you're first introduced to her, and she's not who the Yennefer we're accustomed to, which was this, you know, glamorous woman, you know, flawless from top to bottom, like we had seen in the games, right? Like, I'm coming from someone who played Witcher 2, played Witcher 3, the show was announced, I read some of the book, and then I got into this show. So for me, it was interesting seeing that transformation for her as a character, both physically and emotionally, seeing her grow with strength. I was surprisingly enamored by her character growth, probably more than anyone else in the show. I really, really liked what they did with her, and I personally didn't expect to do that. I've seen online a lot of people comparing Ciri to how Arya Stark was in the beginning of Game of Thrones and how she sort of transformed over time. I can definitely understand that comparison. I personally don't mind that, because Arya Stark was literally my favorite character in the show from day one. Like, I'd always been a huge fan of her, and when she started to develop and turn into a badass, like, I was a huge fan of that. So any comparison to Arya Stark is good in my book. I think that's a big compliment. I really like Maisie Williams and what she did with that character. And so I think Ciri was also interesting. But I think what this show does best is managing to commit to this balancing act of all these arcs and all these things happening and start to slowly meld them together. It has a really fine touch to it, and you can tell that's because the people who worked on this show did seem very familiar with the books, and I think where they did reshuffle was in the right places. Like, I do feel delivering that choice to Geralt with Renfri and changing how the bar fight worked early on in the story really aided in investing you in Geralt not being able to play this middleman and just be like, give me my coin. Like, sometimes he's got to make a choice. I love that about the show, and so I think those types of changes were actually healthy and made it ultimately more interesting as a viewing experience. But if you read some of the books and then you went into this show, it was a good change where you were like, oh wow, like that wasn't a bad, oh my god, why did they do that type of change. That seemed to have actually aided the pacing of the show. I think its biggest issue, like I said, its Achilles heel is not properly informing the viewer. Whether you read the books or not, it's not properly informing the viewer. There is this time gap. And when it does so, it's very subtle. It expects the viewer to know, which I'll get into now and why I like that. I feel like so many shows nowadays just sacrifice everything for accessibility. I like that a show just assumes the viewer knows and hopes that they did their research. I like that they went with this route and just said, okay, they should know this is based off the books. They should know that there is a time gap here. Let's tell our story now. Because I think there is the chance that if they try to over-explain things with the time gap, like, what if they just did like a 13 years later thing on screen, and then it went to Ciri, and then it went back? I just, sorry, I hit the mic there, but I don't know. For me personally, I feel like that would have been a little disjointed, a little clunky. I'm glad that they just went with it, right? They just said, screw it, they'll figure it out, because enough people complain about it that eventually it will, I think, invalidate that complaint, right? Because then so many people will know about it that, okay, there is this time skip here. So I think they could have just told it a little bit better some way, just to clue in the viewer. Because they do, but like I said, it's incredibly subtle. When it comes to the fight choreography, I already saw some clips for it on Twitter, but one of the first ones with Geralt is right in Blaviken, and it's so well done. I don't know if it's on the level of, like, I think of Daredevil on Netflix, like, oh my god, the fights like on the stairwell, holy smokes, man, they're just these long drawn out fights. This show has like jump cuts and stuff. Like, there's this one battle where they're in like a war and Nilfgaard's invading, and it is very like jumpy, flashy. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Lord of the Rings, where it's like dark and you're like, okay, I can't even tell what's going on here. Gave me a little bit of that feeling there. Game of Thrones is another one. That one's more guilty of it than anything, with the really dark episodes. One thing I was actually surprised about was the score. I really liked the score for the show. I thought that the music that played in the background was great. Like, it evoked everything I thought of with The Witcher. It had such a good feel to it. I don't know how else to explain it other than that. It was very much The Witcher, and I'm just happy that they didn't throw that to the wayside for some typical medieval fantasy type of score with loud trumpets when battles happen and stuff. Like, I'm happy that they went the route that I think a lot of people who play the games would actually be familiar with. I think it's one of the things that the game does exceptionally well. One other complaint I do have, and this may sound a little weird, but there is so much fucking crying in this show. So much. Every scene, someone could take a dump on the side of the road and you see tears rolling down their face. Like, Every single somber, slightly sad moment involves tears. And I get that a lot of parts in the show are sad, but they don't hit as hard because everyone cries over everything. Everything. There's so many tears. Everyone loves to cry in The Witcher Netflix. It is mind-blowing, I think. It's just something that I picked up on, like a nitpick, and you're like, damn it, brain, like, why'd you have to notice that? In every other scene, it felt like someone was crying. And maybe I'm not the only one who noticed it. But yeah, overall, across the board, I'm looking at my notes here in front of me. I liked how they established the arcs. I liked how they really built the characters out. I think the main three, Geralt, Ciri, Yennefer, they did an exceptional job with them. I think the show flowed well if you knew what was going on. I think it get a little clunky if you're not familiar with some of the source material. But overall, it was a million times better than I expected in the first place when we first started talking about it. It started to show promise as it approached, but it definitely delivered in a lot of areas, and I'm glad it did. It's a good sign that, you know, we can see these adaptations, whether it's a book or a game, be done successfully and hopefully bring more popularity to these franchises that are built on games as well. So I think it's great that The Witcher is getting its nod. Ultimately, this was my really rough review of the Netflix's Witcher show. I don't do show reviews, and I think it's obvious why. I don't do movie reviews. I think that's also obvious as to why. It's a lot more casual, laid back, and I don't think I get as cutting deep with movies and shows as I do with games, because I'm not like, oh, but there's these beautiful visual effects, and oh, there's CGI there, and this was a beautiful shot here, a wide angle. I'm like, who cares? And why should I, right? Like, but I get there's like, you know, people probably think the same thing when I'm talking in video games about good animation, great use of color, right? So, you know, to each their own. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hopefully it's just one more opinion you can sort of throw into the pot of what the conversation is for The Witcher. This is actually my last video I'm recording day of for the rest of 2019. I'm officially on vacation after this, so for those of you who tuned in this long, I just want to thank you guys so much for another exceptional year. I think 2020 is going to be really good for gaming in general. We got a new generation coming soon. We have really, really awesome looking games. And look, I finally think my schedule will allow me to deliver on a lot of the promises I had made. Getting back into the studio, like my actual studio space, not my bedroom here. And I think my life will ultimately loosen up a little bit in 2020, where I can deliver to you guys more of what I had promised in 2020. I was able to show flashes of it, but ultimately I want to give more of that. And you'll see a lot of studio-based productions in these videos I have scheduled in advance for the next couple of weeks while I'm gone. They're some of the best videos I produced all year, and I'm so excited to see people's feedback on them, because it kind of uses my production set to the fullest extent. So I really, really cannot wait to see what people think. But anyway, thank you guys for another wonderful year, and I will talk with all of you soon. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.